Krown, Gridiron Nation is back at you for week 2. I'm Jim, he's Gord, and Mike Hogan is back in the house as we roll into the 2-minute offense. A good day for Peterborough's Jared Wayne and the Pitt Panthers in Knoxville. 3 receptions for 56 yards for the field side wideout. Guess what? He also added a 16-yard TD pass. 44-13 Penn State over Ball State. Ottawa's Jesse Lucchetta making an early move on the Butkus Award and the Cornish Trophy. A pick 6 for Lucchetta, along with 4 tackles and a shared TFL. And don't forget, safety Jonathan Sutherland, 4 tackles and a TFL. The Crimson Tide roll to another early season easy victory over Mercer, 48-14. John Mechie III, 5 receptions, 70 yards. We have an Adjo sighting in Clemson in that 49-3 beatdown of South Carolina State. 2 receptions for 18 yards. The Illini dropped to 1-2 with a 42-14 loss to Virginia. After a game off, Chase Brown led Illinois with 42 yards rushing and a TD, 70 yards in total from scrimmage. Brother Sidney with 2 tackles and a pass breakup at cornerback. Another solid performance for the defensive Swiss Army knife known as Enoch Maconzo. Coastal Carolina with a 49-22 win over Kansas. Enoch, 6 tackles and 2.5 TFL. Rutgers-Syracuse definition of a defensive game. This thing was tied at 0s at the half. Rutgers eventually with a 17-7 win. Canadian standout Jeffrey Cantonar-Coup for Syracuse, 3 tackles and a TFL. Sophomore quarterback Quincy Bond of Hamilton, Ontario, came off the bench for those fighting Hawks. He went 2 of 2 for 16 yards and a touchdown. How about those numbers? Windsor's Quinton Seguin, 3 tackles, in on a TFL, and a pass breakup, but it was in a losing cause. Ohio with a 28-26 loss to Duquesne. Quarterback wasn't an issue. Curtis Rourke, 14-22 for 168 and a TD. Added another 28 yards rushing and another TD on the ground. Hawaii with a 45-27 loss at Oregon State, but the prime target once again for the Warriors, Mississauga's Nick Mardner. 6 receptions, 110 yards, and a touchdown. On the season, 13 receptions, 242 yards, and 2 TDs with an average reception of 18.6 per game. North Vancouver native Christy Elliott made NC2A history on Saturday. The 21-year-old Elliott became the first Canadian female to score a point in an NCAA game on a Simon Fraser PAT against Linfield in a 56-20 loss. Elliott joined Saskatoon Hilltop linebacker Emery Dale and Manitoba Bison DB Rena Izuka as Canadian women on college and junior rosters. 3 women at the high performance level, but 156 Canadians overall in D1 football. But where do they come from? Maybe this is the Jesse Lucchetta salute piece, because here's your top 10 list. And the national capital is the capital of football. I'm going to start with Gord here. There are some small town places that punch well beyond their weight. 3 players from Fort McMurray, for example, but it's the urban centers that drive the numbers. Which city do you see as Canada's football factory?
Well, you alluded to it already, Jim, but I'm going to go to the national capital in the Ottawa area, and you see names like Lucchetta, Sutherland coming out of there. I think there's about 8 Ottawa natives total on FBS rosters right now. That's one of the highest numbers around, and it's great football structure from top to bottom in Ottawa. You have the 2 local universities there. You have the Sooners junior program. You have great youth ranks, great prep school ranks in and around the city, including one of the Canada Prep locations. You know, there's a lot going on in the nation's capital right now, and it's this great cultural melting pot too, where it's kind of in the middle of that French hotbed of football between Montreal and Quebec, and then the English hotbed in eastern and central Ontario. So there's a lot going on in the national capital area, and you talked about above their weight with regards to the small towns. By American standards, Ottawa would still be a small town, and so for that reason, they punch well above their weight. just like they do in pretty much everything else.
Well, if we can combine Ottawa, Gatineau as one region, I'm going to do the same thing with sort of GTA West and go with Brampton and Mississauga. You look at what's being produced there. If there's a prohibitive favorite maybe for the Cornish Award this year would be John Mechie. He's from Brampton. Likewise, Josh Palmer, who, had his NFL debut last week for the Chargers. You've got, maybe this is just my recency or I guess area bias showing here, but with the Argos, we have 6 players from the area on our roster, and they're not slouches either. It's Enoch Mwamba and Juwan Breskeson and Dejan Brissett. And then you've got the 2 kids from Laurier. You've got Sam Achimpong and Robbie Smith and Jack Cassar from Carleton, all from the Brampton Mississauga area. So, you just look, it's not just a breeding ground for the NCAA, but for the NFL and for the CFL as well. As Gord mentioned, the programs in Ottawa are spectacular. Likewise in Brampton and Mississauga, you look around U Sports programs and it's dotted with players from these 2 regions.
And you want to talk about a region that punches well above its weight, like Jim was alluding to. Northern Alberta is just exploding right now, and it's in the Edmonton area, but it's not just in the Edmonton area. He alluded to Fort McMurray. Sherwood Park is a football hotbed with a couple of the best prep programs in the province in that town. You see big names like Lamar Goods coming out of Northern Alberta, like Ajo coming out of Northern Alberta. It's a really growing area that is seeing an influx of people, and in particular immigrant populations, that appear to be pumping out of there some great talent. And I got to give kudos to some of the coaching staffs that are willing to go up to some of these northern areas. I know a couple of the coaches that are coaching up in Fort McMurray. They're not from there. They're not from anywhere near there, but life circumstances brought them up there, and they're doing a fantastic job with a fairly remote community in building something meaningful and excellent.
So the question is, what Canadian town and player would reign supreme in our stateside 5? The John Mechie III train keeps on a-rolling, 5 catches and 70 yards in the annual Alabama annihilation of Mercer. Ohio and Oakville quarterback Curtis Rourke, 14 of 22 for 168 and a TD. He added another on the ground along with 28 yards rushing. Jared Wayne was a little bit of everything for Pitt in Tennessee. 3 catches for 56 yards, and he threw a 16-yard TD in the Panther win. First Canadian over the century mark, Nick Mardner of Hawaii. 6 receptions for 110 yards and a tutty in the loss to Oregon State. And at number 1, it's Ottawa's Jesse Luketa with a gem of a game for Penn State. The D and linebacker hybrid senior with a pick 6, along with 4 tackles and a TFL in a convincing win over Ball State. Coming up, this ain't your uncle's cue. 2 games in Canadian University ball that blindsided just about everyone in our 3-minute warning. The night before, Concordia scored a major 31-28 upset in Montreal. First Stinger win over the Caravan in 11 years, and this is what lightning looks like when it strikes twice in the queue. Sherbrooke already up, and Pierre-Olivier Cadore gets some daylight and turns on the Jets 67 yards later for the touche Verreor, part of a 20-point second quarter that Laval could not overcome. 23-17 for Sherby, the first win for the Green Guys over the Red Ones in 33 tries. Chapter 1 of the Rock Fight this weekend as Montreal takes on Laval. McGill or Concordia could be all alone or in a tie for first place after this week. Did not see that coming. Football was supposed to be like the rest of society through COVID and lockdowns. The rich were supposed to get richer. Not the case, though, for the first 3 weeks of football in Quebec. Mike, what is behind all of this?
I don't know if there's some grand big conspiracy or big picture thing like you're suggesting. I just think that maybe in Montreal you've got a new coach, and I'm sure the coach Ian Luca will eventually get things righted there, and Anthony Calvillo being on the staff, they've got some good teachers. Maybe it's just a little bit of time to adapt to the program changes. Laval, they are still stocked and stacked, and I think that's just a question of maybe getting the machine to rev up. Maybe there's a part of me that wants to play, if you want to look at, football through the great picture Jim Mullen's trying to project here. Maybe there's socialism at work, Jimmy, for you, and maybe we're seeing the rich give back to the poor a little bit, and everybody's getting a little bit closer together from a football standpoint, from a fan standpoint. I wouldn't be unhappy with that because I like it when it's competitive every week, but I just see that you still have two stacked teams in Quebec, and this was a one-off, but what a great way to bring attention to the start of the season.
Yeah, and I mean, especially with the Laval loss, it looks to me like it's kind of an anomaly. If you look, they racked up about 450 yards of offense in that game, and they never got into the end zone. They stalled out repeatedly in the red zone. I think they had to settle for 5 field goals in that game. That's not a winning formula in pretty much any brand of football, unless, frankly, you're Laval in years past. And one of the things that was a little bit of a red flag this past weekend was that historically Laval has had their times where they have struggled to produce a ton of points offensively, but they have always had the defense that gives them a very good chance to win those games anyway, and that just didn't materialize this past week. So I'm going to guess that on both sides of the ball, they've got some easy things to adjust there. As for Montreal, their defense looks a little softer than it has historically been at this point in time too, so it should be interesting to see if they can get back up to that elite level. But as for the power shift, I do start to wonder if we're seeing a little bit of a trickle-down effect here from that missing year. Did more of these top stars out of the CEGEP prep ranks come out of Quebec when historically they would have stayed at Laval or Montreal? That lost momentum that we talked about on last week's program can affect in different areas in different ways. Maybe this is one of the ways it's manifesting here, but I would say it's definitely too soon to draw that kind of sweeping conclusion just yet.
So can we expect this kind of volatility out of the West, Ontario, and Atlantic Canada as they start up their 6-game abbreviated seasons, Gord?
It's quite possible. I mean, for no other reason than the fact that 6 games is a much smaller sample size and has less of a possibility of separating the crews, especially in the OUA where everybody is not playing everybody. But one of the ongoing themes that I think starts in the RSEQ and can continue on to the rest of these conferences is that quarterback play, transcendent quarterback play, can change everything. When we've seen teams that have flirted with that top 2 in Quebec, that have upset the apple cart a little bit over the past decade or so, it's been because they've had excellent quarterbacking that has pulled them up to that level. And maybe with Olivier Waugh, Concordia might have something starting to develop there, but that could be an ongoing theme. Another guy I think of is Clayton Sequeira at the University of Toronto, who's coming back for his final season. He's a guy that could play at a level to potentially upset the pecking order as well. So those are the guys that I would look for as outliers to maybe keep an eye on.
And I would agree to the extent that we really don't know what to expect because we didn't even see, the interlocking scrimmages or anything this year. And, at the CFL level, all bets were off because there were no exhibition games. It might be the same thing happening at the U Sports level. I have no idea what to expect this week in the OUA or out west, which is great. Same thing in the AU. There are just so many questions because we haven't seen this team. We haven't seen these teams. We haven't seen this roster together in over a year. So, it's wide open. Don't be surprised if we see upsets, maybe not to the magnitude we did in Quebec, but if there's a fairly significant upset in one of the other conferences, should we be surprised? Absolutely not.
So continuity has been broken. Student athletes have got on with their lives. Only 2 of the top 5 quarterbacks are returning to university in 2021. Gone, most notably, Adam Sinagra on the defending champion Calgary Dinos and Chris Merchant on the perennial powerhouse Western Mustangs. 2 questions in one, starting with Gord. Will teams like Calgary and Western get pulled back into the pack, just like what we've seen in Quebec so far with Laval and Montreal? And who steps up with some top-line talent here?
Well, as far as the Calgary and Western question, it's tough for me to put my eggs in that basket because, as Mike alluded to with Laval and Montreal, you look at the rosters and the rosters are still loaded with talent. But again, like I said before, when you have that smaller sample size of a 6-game season, that one anomaly game can hurt you more than it normally would. And I don't know that that's necessarily going to be indicative of those teams falling back to the pack. And that's going to be the tough thing from this season, is that it's kind of our job to draw conclusions from these things so that we have talking points. But it may be difficult to really draw a lot of extensive long-term conclusions from watching this season because of that. As for the quarterback question, with the amount of uncertainty that Mike alluded to, you just don't know who's going to emerge. But one guy that I have my eyes on out west here is Sawyer Bittner, a guy who played a little bit when he was out at the University of Ottawa, showed a lot of promise there, has since returned to the University of Regina, had a pretty good first season at Regina, but has been the undisputed guy coming into this season. They have a new head coach in Mark McConkey there, who is an offensively oriented guy, graduating from the offensive coordinator role, of course. But that's a guy that you may see elevate himself into that top tier conversation out west here. But other than that, there's just so much unknown. It's hard to put a name on things.
I just can't believe we're talking about quarterbacks in U Sports and we haven't talked about Trey Ford yet. The most dynamic quarterback certainly in U Sports football right now, maybe a generational talent. I mean, he was the OUA MVP, he was the second team All-Canadian quarterback when we last played, 5,600 career passing yards. He's one rush short of 2,000 in his career as well. He's just a special guy and is certainly worth the watch. And I know that Gord a little bit earlier on talked about Clay Sequeira as well at University of Toronto, and he snuck up on a lot of people last year, and he's got his top two receivers back with Corby and Lovegrove. So I'm really curious to see what they do. There's going to be one or two newcomers that we really haven't focused on yet that are going to be impact players for varsity this year. That's another quarterback that maybe isn't getting his due so far.
Looking at the performance of drafted CFL players in the NCAA, and the Hamilton Tiger Cats have to be the happiest team this week. Cornerback and Calgary native Dean Leonard was a standout at Ole Miss, not only with a pass breakup, but with a pair of tackles in run support, and D-lineman Mo Diallo with his first solid effort in Arizona coming off that transfer. Coming up next, it's the CJFL's version of Shelbyville versus Springfield. Regina Thunder and Saskatoon tied at 13, final play of regulation. Regina's Eric Maximuk from 51 yards is good, and the Saskatoon Hilltops' 32-game win streak is done. 4 years and 2 days. The Thunder are undefeated, and as a gift, they get to host Saskatoon this weekend. Straight out of Windsor, the St. Clair Fratmen lead the OFC. And in BC, the Sun and Langley Rams are undefeated, and they will tangle this weekend. Gritty, unheralded, and under the radar weekend warriors to you, Mike.
Olivier Wall, we talked about him earlier in the broadcast, and how can you not? Leads his team to a huge upset win, 325 yards passing, roughly, threw for 4 touchdowns, no picks, also threw 2 touchdowns in the last 8 minutes. Gotta go with Mr. Wall. That was fantastic.
And I'm going to go with my new sentimental favorite NCAA team, Texas State, who has as much of an affinity for Canadian offensive linemen as CFL teams do, having brought in 3 in the last year. And 2 of those guys are the starting right side of their offensive line right now, Kyle Hergel and Liam Dobson, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers' first-round pick. And they helped lead the Texas State Bobcats to a big road win in overtime over FIU this weekend. Now, the Bobcats have historically been a fairly bottom-feeding program in the FBS. They've only been in the FBS for about a decade at this point in time. It's been a long road to relevance for them. But if a few Canadians can help spark their turnaround into a program worth paying attention to, I think that's worth highlighting, especially if they're guys that play my old positions. So it's Kyle Hergel and Liam Dobson, my weekend warriors.
Triple W2K, what do you want to know heading into this week? And I'll throw it to Gord.
What I want to know this week is, does the transitive property apply to Fresno State? And by that I mean, Is Fresno State very good? They've smacked two pretty poor teams. They blew Connecticut out of the water to open the season. They beat an FCS opponent this past weekend. In between, they sandwiched that with a loss at Oregon, where they pushed Oregon to the brink and had us talking about, well, Oregon doesn't seem as legit as people thought they were going to be, and this is going to be a pretty ugly year for the Pac-12. And what does Oregon do? They walk into Columbus and upset the Ohio State Buckeyes on the road. And so now I'm looking at Fresno State and going, okay, well, what have we got here in this Fresno State team? They play in a conference in the Mountain West that has seen teams come out of nowhere like San Jose State last season and win the whole thing. They look like they might have the potential to hit that ceiling, and they come into this week on the road again against another Pac-12 opponent, and one who is having a fantastic start to their season in my UCLA Bruins, up to number 11 in the country. It's going to be a huge test for Fresno State, but I want to see if that Oregon performance was a one-off or if they are for real.
What I want to know is where's the next upset coming from after the two monsters in Quebec? I mean, does York beat Laurier this week? Does Windsor beat Waterloo? You're probably saying not a prayer, but we would have said the same thing a week ago looking at the Quebec game. So will there be another huge upset this weekend? That's what I want to know.
Picks of the week coming up next. Last week, we were all over the favorites when it came to U Sports point spreads, and we got stung both times. This week, we've got Laval by 2.5 over Montreal with a tiny over-under of 29. They don't put many points on the board. McGill by 1 over Concordia with an over-under of 39. And in the OUA, the headliner is McMaster at Western with the Mustangs favored by 2. They're at home with an over-under of 48. So I'm going to pick for the lot of you here when it comes to U Sports games. I'm going to take McGill, I'm going to take Laval, and I'm going to take McMaster because I think that's going to be a 1-point game. Now to the American games. I'm going to throw it first to you, Mike. I'll bet there's an Argo flavor to this.
I'm really curious to see Florida State and Wake Forest on a couple of different reasons. I mean, Wake Forest is coming off a couple of huge wins and are actually 6-point favorites over Florida State, which on paper looks kind of nuts. But when you dig down a little bit, there's also a Canadian angle, and it's a guy from where else but Ottawa, and that's Luigi Villain, who was one of our Argonaut draft picks in the 3rd round, transferred from Michigan and wanted to have one last good go, hopefully an injury-free season. He has started out okay with multiple tackles, including a sack and a half and a tackle and a half for a loss. So that's the game. Want to see what happens. Got to go with Wake Forest. 6 points, but why not?
And I'm going to go out to the Northeast, where Coastal Carolina travels up to upstate New York to face the Buffalo Bulls, and a reeling Buffalo Bulls program at that. They've struggled out of the gate. They lost their head coach, Lance Leipold. He moved to Kansas. He was very highly regarded, coming all the way up from Div 3 to turn Buffalo into a MAC powerhouse over the last couple of years. They seem to be having a tough time transitioning from that. Meanwhile, Coastal keeps rolling. They are undefeated. They're ranked well into the top 25. I believe I saw 16 in the last ranking. And Enoch McConzo, the Canadian native from Lachine, Quebec, had a very solid performance this past week in their win. The Chanticleers are favored by 10.5 points. Based on the form I've seen this season so far, I'm going to take the points there, and I think they're winning it by more than 10.5. So I'm picking Coastal minus the 10.5 here.
So for everybody here on Krown Gridiron Nation, as usual, this is Jim Mullen saying, let's get out to the game.